sure that the numbers are going up, that we're having everyone being able to get into this, being able to watch the event, and then we'll start. So if you want some water, a blanket, a comfy chair, grab what you want, and then we will begin. So let me give it another 5 seconds before we start this thing. Alrighty. It looks like the numbers are laying low. Well, not laying low, but they're evening out. So here we are. Thank you all for joining us for PMP Live. My name is Hannah Manwiller, and I am so excited to have all of you here and our wonderful 2 guests to talk about this topic. At any point throughout this discussion, if you want to put something in the chat, if you want to put something in the Q&A, please feel free to do that. I always say questions shouldn't be left for last, because then we can't read it and we can't ask it. So it's really hard to be able to have a really good dialogue if they're not in there. So if you hear anything during the discussion, the book talk, put it in the Q&A if you have any questions. Alrighty, so for today's event, we are reading, or at least learning more about God and Anatomy, which is written by the amazing Francesca Stavrakopoulou. And if I've said that wrong, her last name, she can most definitely correct me later. She is a professor of the Hebrew Bible and ancient religion at the University of Exeter. She is a graduate of Oxford University, and her focus was ancient history and Judah. Jack Miles is going to be in conversation with her today. He's so many things. Let me start at the beginning. He is a professor and he has a doctorate in Eastern languages from Harvard University. He was a MacArthur Fellow, and he also won a Pulitzer Prize for God biography. We're terribly into books that have God and a little thing afterwards. Today is God and Anatomy, and before was God, a biography from Jack Miles. I feel like they go together. So if you have anything else that you would like to put in the chat, if you'd like to say thank you to them at any time, please do that there. I think that is everything that we need to go over. Oh, there is something for this event that I wanted to say. As you're using the chat and as you're using the Q&A, remember that this is a safe space where everyone can have their thoughts heard, everyone can have their thoughts being said. And so let's make sure that we're using kind, thoughtful, and rounded words. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you so much for joining, and I'm going to hand this off to them. Bye.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to, I think, what will be a stimulating and enjoyable conversation. Whenever we're talking about the body, everyone sits up straight and listens particularly closely. But what I would like to open with before I turn to God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou, I would like to take you back to perhaps freshman in high school, when you were learning the difference between simile and metaphor. Robert Burns wrote, "My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. My love is like a melody that's sweetly sung in tune." He used a simile. He used the word like. If he said, "My love is a red, red rose, my love is a melody," that would have been a metaphor, not a simile. He used the simile, he used like because it worked better for the scansion, I've always thought. But you can turn this around. And if I say, "My rose is like a virgin who's not quite ready to open," now I'm using the body as the tool of the metaphor, and you're thinking about the enfolded petals of a rose, and you're also thinking about the enfolded labia of a vagina. Oh, suddenly it gets very racy, doesn't it? The human body is a rich source of metaphors, the richest of all. And what Francesca Stavrakopoulou has done in this remarkable book, God and Anatomy, is bring together for us all of the ways in which ancient Semitic antiquity and even all of the heirs of Western Asian religion down to our own day have imagined God in ways that required the use of the male body. So I'm going to begin just to give you a sense of how she has organized this book, and also organized all of these references, particularly those that are in the Bible, but not only those, around parts of the body. So her first chapter is called Feet and Legs, and there are 3 chapters: Grounded, Footloose, and Sensational Feet. And then part 2, Genitals. I think let me do it one at a time, and let's just work from the bottom up, so to speak. So we have feet and legs, and I'm going to offer one little quote here, Francesca, and allow you to take it from there. We're talking now about God's feet. So here's a quote. Yahweh was at risk of stepping in something unpleasant if he didn't take the necessary precautions. It is for this reason that he issues the Israelites traveling from Egypt to the promised land with special instructions for defecation. You shall have a designated area outside the camp to which you shall go. With your utensils, you shall have a trowel. When you relieve yourselves outside, you shall dig a hole with it, and then cover up your excrement, because Yahweh, your God, walks in your camp. You wouldn't want God stepping in your poop, would you? So let me invite you, Francesca, to talk more to us, beginning from there, but leaping to whatever other part of this first part of your book you would like, about the lower extremities of the Lord.
Thank you. Yeah. That text is a fantastic one in the Bible, because it really brings to life vividly one of the most fundamental distinctions that was drawn between holy space and ordinary space in the ancient world. And that was the idea that certain things could not be transferred into holy space. And that included feces, human feces, not so much animal feces. Gods were kind of quite comfortable with the idea of sacrificial animals' feces being in their temple precincts, but human feces was completely different. I feel like I've said the word feces a number of times already. But yeah, this text is about the idea that people felt that their deity or deities were manifest in some ways in the earthly realm. So a temple, if you like, was a meeting place between the heavenly realm above and the earthly realm beneath it. And in that particular text, what Yahweh is trying to say is that he is a God, because the story is set in the people's exodus from Egypt to the promised land. And so God is traveling with them. And he says, he is coming into the land with them, along with Moses and the tribes. But they are to maintain certain standard of ritual purity in the camps that they set up, and because he is walking with them, he is among them, that his divine presence is with them. And so that means that they need to go outside of the bounds of their encampment in order to defecate, because he
what other examples can you give us of the lower parts of God?
And well, one of the most kind of emphatic, it's found in several texts in the Old Testament, or what in Jewish tradition is called Tanakh. In scholarship, we tend to prefer to call it the Hebrew Bible. And one of the most emphatic is this insistence by God when he's talking about the Jerusalem temple, that this is, he says, the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will place my feet. And it's that sense of placement, of presence, of planting his feet in this space. It's about occupation, it's about permanence, it's about it's almost this kind of proprietorial ownership of space. And one of the things I do in the book, I begin quite early on in the feet section by talking about a temple in Syria at a place called Ain Dara, which was extraordinary. It's sort of, in terms of its blueprint, if you like, it's very typical of a lot of West Semitic temples that we find in terms of architecture. It's sort of rectangular shaped and split into 3 parts, with the Holy of Holies at the very back of the building. And in this incredible temple, it's Iron Age, so it kind of maps roughly onto the time when most scholars think that the temple supposedly built by Solomon was constructed in Jerusalem and was in operation. And this incredible temple has these giant, enormous, almost a meter long footprints carved into the threshold at the entrance to the temple, and then a huge stride, another footprint walking into the temple, and then another footprint right at the very back in the Holy of Holies. And this was the way, we're not entirely sure which deity was occupying this temple, but temples were seen to be the divine residences of gods. But these footprints indicate the presence, the corporeal presence of the deity who sets their feet in their holy place.
Oh, but what about the fact that the temple only came along at a midpoint in Israelite history, and before then, if God was placing his feet anywhere, he's placing them on the Ark of the Covenant, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's in terms of the biblical narrative, the fantasy, if you like, of the past, the portrayal of the past. Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant comes first, and that very much is cast as, it's weird. I mean, in some texts, it's just kind of demythologized. It's simply a box in which the 10 Commandments, the tablets of stone are placed. But in a lot of other biblical texts, this is basically functions as a throne and a pedestal and a footstool of the deity. And it's this object, this sacred object that on which he either stands or places his feet when he's enthroned above it, that is carried.
Do you think that there was a statue then of Yahweh?
I think it's very likely, and I mean, increasing numbers of scholars in my field are increasingly of the opinion that, like most other ancient Southwest Asian cultures and ancient Egyptian cultures, ancient Greek and Roman, that the gods weren't just imagined to have human-shaped bodies, but they were worshipped. They were manifest in little cult statues that weren't just symbols or representations of the deity. They were understood to be manifestations, material manifestations of the particular god or goddess. And increasing numbers of scholars now, we look at texts, a lot of texts that we see in the Psalms that talk about, I want to go into the temple, I will behold your face, I will look upon you, I will see you, behold your beauty, all this kind of stuff. Lots of texts that talk about processions of Yahweh around his city, into Jerusalem and out of the temple. So increasingly scholars are starting to suspect that actually there probably were among certain groups of Yahweh worshippers those who used cult statues.
But is it archaeology, some archaeological discovery that has made them start thinking this way? Because generally speaking, we don't think we have statues of Yahweh from antiquity the way we might have statues of Apollo or Zeus.
We have statues of Apollo or Zeus, but interestingly, we know that in Mesopotamia, cult statues were used. I mean, we have ritual texts talking about these cult statues. We have inscriptions from conquering kings talking about the god-napping, if you like, of these statues when they invaded other peoples. But we don't have any of those left from Mesopotamia either, even though we know that they were used. And it's a similar kind of thing. Statues were very lootable.
So the absence of substantial material remains of the statues isn't a decisive consideration then?
No, and we also have a lot of clay figurines, and increasing numbers are coming to light that suggest that people were using cult objects in their worship. Primarily, they're associated with what we call domestic or household religion. So horse and rider figurines of what look to be women, but increasingly we're finding some little what look to be male figures. Now, I'm not saying that these are Yahweh, but what I'm saying is that they indicate that the use of images in religious practice was relatively normative. And I think that's how we can partly understand the ban on images in the 10 Commandments, when God says, you shall not make an image, you shall not bow down to them and worship them. I mean, it kind of implies that that's exactly what people were doing. And so that ban comes about as a move away from cult images, probably around the 6th century BCE, when the kingdom of Judah, with its capital Jerusalem, was invaded by the Babylonians and the temple was destroyed. But that move comes about because it flagged up a theological vulnerability, I think, on the part of those who used cult statues and valued them, because, as I said, this was about god-napping, and it rendered a deity very vulnerable if their statue could be taken off into captivity, into a foreign land. So I think that's where that
images
ban
of
on
Marduk were fought over. Whoever won,
yeah,
the winner took
exactly.
Marduk home with him. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember on my first trip to Naples, I could see from my hotel Vesuvius. And that's when I thought I understood for the first time a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night. Because during the day, you see, I'm sure you must have seen Vesuvius a few times in your life. You see the smoke, and then if it's active, after dark, you don't see the smoke anymore, but you do see the fire, which you do not see during the day.
Yeah.
And the notion that when the Israelites left Sinai, they carried the ark with them, but it was accompanied by the volcano, with smoke in the day and fire at night. But to me, that's an amazing image. But at a certain point, perhaps after settled residents in the land, that's when statues began to replace that imagined volcano. Would you?
Yeah, I think there are lots of different ways in which the deity could be imagined. I mean, that's the thing. We get the impression when you read the Bible, you start at Genesis and you end at Revelation, and you kind of think this has all been written kind of not necessarily in one go, but it's all been written in a certain order to tell a story. But like any, and I'm sure like you're the same, like any writer, you don't normally start at the beginning when you write a book. You start somewhere else and then rework it. And we know that these texts have been reworked and reshaped over and were produced by lots of different scribal groups and priestly groups and various others. And so there are certain people that leaned towards say zoomorphic ideas of God. We know that he was likely worshipped, this particular god, like the god Baal and like the god Ale, was likely worshipped in zoomorphic form with cult statues of little bulls. I mean, we've got lots of kind of hints of that in the biblical texts and archaeologically as well. So there was lots of diversity, is what I'm saying, in early traditions about this deity. But what does seem to happen is that when you've got temples, so permanent dwelling places for a deity, monumental architecture that demands huge amount of resources, both in terms of economics and the personnel.
I want to move on, though. We've got other parts of the body to cover.
Yeah, we do.
I certainly do not want to skip part 2, genitals, and the subchapters here are cover up, phallic masculinities, perfecting the penis, and divine sex. And here, let me give you a quote from page 107, where you quote from Hosea chapter 2, verses 20 to 23. This is about how God, the God of the Bible, fertilizes Jezreel, which is a synonym for the land. Jezreel means he seeds, the fertile northern portion of the promised land, famous for its rich soils. I'm quoting from the Bible now. I will take you for my wife in faithfulness, and you will know Yahweh. On that day I will fructify, says Yahweh. I will fructify the heavens, and they will fructify the earth. The earth will fructify the grain, the wine, and the soil, and they will fructify Israel, and I will seed her for myself in the land. For you, this is all euphemisms for exactly what?
It's about sex, intercourse, but it's also about the idea of a fertility god. There's this misconception, I think, a broader misconception that in the ancient world, goddesses were all about fertility, but they weren't. Goddesses quite often were about nurturing a child once it was in the womb and looking after the pregnancy and helping to deliver the child. But fertility was a masculine divine attribute. It wasn't a feminine attribute in that sense. So this quotation from Hosea comes in a part of the book where I'm talking about the idea of God as a fertility deity, a very good old-fashioned fertility deity, but also it's drawing on ancient mythological motifs in which that you do get a deity, a male deity, impregnating, if you like, the earth, and sowing his seed within her as a means of bringing life into the created realm. But that's an example.
Let me quote from you, and after in the words immediately following that quote. In this poem in the book of Hosea, dated to about the 8th century BCE, Yahweh's penis may well be veiled from direct view, hidden behind a modesty screen of euphemism and wordplay, but the bodily sexual connotations are impossible to miss. Like the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, who bear witness to Yahweh's genitalia, the prophet Hosea is well aware that God is equipped with a penis, and it is large enough and potent enough to arouse and fertilize the heavens and the earth.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, that talk about Hosea follows on my discussion of these two incredible visions that prophets are said to have seen of Yahweh enthroned. The prophet Ezekiel sees the deity enthroned before him, and he says a human-shaped figure, like looking like a human being sitting on the throne, and he describes it as this mysterious spectacle, and the top half of the deity's body is shrouded by bright light and fire and noise, and the bottom half of his body is shrouded too. But the one part of the body that he describes, that he sees, is God's motnaim, a Hebrew term that is normally translated in English as something in Bibles. It's kind of like loins, but actually quite often is more accurately translated as something like genitals. It means the very front bit at the top of your thighs. And so that's an extraordinary, it's a real kind of uncovering, if you like, of God's very corporeal genital masculinity. And this wasn't unusual. I mean, it was because the whole point of this book is I tried to put God back into his natural environment, if you like, his early career back in his natural environment, in a much broader ancient Southwest Asian world, in which the gods were understood not just to have human-shaped bodies, but to have genitals that functioned perfectly well. They needed to function perfectly well. And so these features of the biblical texts are reflecting and refracting a lot of this comfort, I suppose, there's no sort of cultural, it wasn't seen as something unsophisticated or primitive to imagine that your deity had a penis, or a large penis even. This was something that was completely normative. So even when a prophet like Ezekiel, who is a priest who's very keen to kind of distance the deity in a lot of ways from the messy realities of earthly life and human existence, even for a priestly figure like that, this is he's very comfortable with the idea that he sees this extraordinary deity in front of him, and happily talks about his motnaim. It's a fantastic text, and that was one of the texts that wasn't allowed to be read in public in early synagogues.
Yes, that's also significant. I want our listeners to know that this book does not deal only with God of the Tanakh or Old Testament, also with Jesus. And that leads me to part 3, entitled Torso, whose subdivisions are back and beyond, inside out, and from belly to bowel. And let me invite you here to talk about, how is it put? Let me get your exact words. I think it is the essential and miraculous constipation of Christ.
Yes. Yeah. There was a really interesting debate early in the early centuries of the Common Era, both within traditionally Jewish circles and in what was increasingly becoming Christian circles. Obviously, Christianity was started off as a Jewish sect or cult, and the distinctions between Christianity and Judaism are not as clear as perhaps we might assume in this period. But these people were very worried about whether Jesus we're back to defecation, about whether Jesus defecated or not, because it impacted on notions of, well, can a deity really defecate? Is this something that gods do, or is it something that just is simply what humans and animals do? And this was a huge debate in Christianity, because there were some Christians that were saying that Jesus, when God was incarnate in Jesus's body, was not, that he put on this human body almost like he was putting on a disguise. He was a phantasm. And so he gave the appearance of eating and drinking, because obviously eating and drinking is a very important part of a lot of the New Testament stories about Jesus. But by that way, they said that he didn't, he was only pretending to eat and drink because that meant that he didn't have to defecate. Because for some, the idea that Christ could produce what some ancient writers called corrupt matter, was just abhorrent. It was just
that view was finally defeated, wasn't it?
It was finally defeated. I mean, by about the fourth century, you still have a few theologians in the 4th century arguing that he didn't defecate. He was miraculously constipated, as one theologian in the ancient world put it. But this was reflecting ideas about Greco-Roman masculinity. This was about the ideal kind of masculinity. So if you could control your body, you could control your body so much that you barely needed to eat or drink, and therefore you barely needed to urinate or defecate, then that demonstrated that you could control everything else in your environment, all the other people in your environment. This
matter of perfect control is something I want us to come back to at the very end. But let me talk about another kind of impurity, and this carries us to the next section of the book, which is arms and hands. Mm-hmm. And here the subdivisions are handedness, arm's reach, divine touch, and holy handbooks. And I'm going to turn to page 260, where you discuss God's burial of Moses.
Yeah.
In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' gravedigger is God himself. And yet this is a little known feature of the biblical story of Moses, for it rarely appears in modern translations. But the Anglo-Saxon artist has well captured the words of the Latin Bible, from which Elfric and his colleagues were working a text known as the Vulgate, which itself offers a faithful reflection of the Hebrew of Deuteronomy 34:6, which reads, Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in the land of Moab at Yahweh's command, and he buried him. Now, what is it that's so shocking about the thought of God burying somebody?
Because in a number of texts in the Torah, or the Pentateuch, of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, corpse contact is defiling, it's impure. Not because the dead are inherently impure, they're not, but simply because there was certain priests who were behind a lot of the material that we have in the Torah in the first 5 books, felt they needed to draw very strict boundaries between the realm of the dead and temples, basically. And, most ancient cultures, that's why you perform mortuary rituals and various sorts of mourning and purification rituals, is because it seemed to be a different kind of state than being alive. But yeah, it's an extraordinary text, because this is all about, you read the Hebrew, and the Hebrew says, as you said, and he buried him in the land of Moab. But later translators, so the ancient Greek translators of these Hebrew texts were really, by this point, these Greek translations produced around the 3rd to the 2nd century BCE. They were really uncomfortable with this idea that God could possibly touch a corpse. How could something so divine, so otherly, could possibly deal with a corpse?
By recovering the physicality of that moment, I personally think that you recover a great tenderness.
Yeah, I agree.
This is an act of love and kindness. Yeah. It even makes me think of Bach's St. Matthew Passion in the aria toward the end. Mache dich mein Herz herein, ich will Jesum jetzt begraben. I'm going to purify thee, O my heart. I must now bury Jesus. It's the same image,
that's one of the most important things for me with this book, is that, it's not about sensational. Obviously it's pointing out a lot of the great stories and myths that are in the Bible that we often kind of don't recognize when we read it. But it's also about, it's giving a sense of that, as you say, there's the really tender stuff about God, this really intimate, sensual, sensitive relationship between God and his worshippers. And I think that's something that's often missed, and particularly for those people that don't know the Bible very well. They think, it's just a really boring book, and why bother? But actually it's a remarkable, it's like time travel reading these ancient texts, and you get a real sense about the ways in which this deity was understood to play a tender role, an intimate role in the lives of his worshippers. And that Moses, God burying Moses in Moab is one of my favorite texts. Absolutely.
Well, now we're moving on to we want to leave time for questions, of course. And the next and last section is entitled Head. There are 5 sections: face to face, headstrong beauty, profile, sense and sensitivity, and gasp and gulp. That last one. But I'm going to use myself as a prop here, not quite a metaphor, but I have silver hair. You see. So was God, when God is portrayed in a physical form, is he portrayed as a boy? Is he portrayed as a 25-year-old man? Or is he portrayed as an old man, as Michelangelo certainly admired him? Now there is a point in the Bible, and maybe you'd like to talk about that and about this issue in general of how old God is at the point when he is portrayed in physical form.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of texts seem to suggest that he is this hypermasculine, quite youthful warrior. And if we compare that kind of description and the words that are used to kind of the iconography that we have from similar cultures, we can, you can safely, it's a guess, but you can safely pretty much assume that he's got very dark hair. So he's got hair more like my color, a dark beard and a moustache, which I'm half Greek. I know that's coming for me at some point in my future. But, it's this kind of like this dark, very masculine guy with kind of red, ruddy skin, like a warrior's masculinity was very much coded as being red in skin. But then you get to the book of Daniel, which is a 2nd century BCE text. And here you have this extraordinary transformation in the portrayal of God. He's no longer portrayed as this youthful warrior. He's now portrayed as his father, because God had a dad, which is a part that I discussed in the beginning of the book. The high god, the traditional high god of these cultures, is a god called Ale, who has had white hair and a long grey beard. And these weren't markers of degeneration, but they were markers of wisdom, of age, of superiority in some ways. And all of a sudden, this imagery, this very ancient mythological imagery, is suddenly transferred onto Yahweh himself. And there he is sitting on a throne with white dazzling robes and white hair and a white beard. And that's when God goes grey, basically. And it's about brightness and whiteness, in a sense of the brightness of the stars, holiness, that sense of something that's so dazzling. And this is a world in which actually, bright white was very unusual. When the New Testament writers are talking about these divine figures, these angelic figures that are found in Jesus' empty tomb, one of the gospel writers said their clothes were white, so white you can never bleach them that white. They were so white. And so this was a sense very much that this was the dazzling whiteness of the stars. Mm-hmm. And in the book of Daniel, you get this aged, wise, grey hair and white beard of an old god transposed onto this younger deity, Yahweh. And then that's the image of this old white-haired, white-bearded deity that gradually increases over time, particularly in Christianity.
Well, but although he is now old and white-haired, he is still very male and very physical. But there does occur, and this is the last little section we're going to have time for before Q&A. There does occur gradually. I'll even read one little passage from Isaiah of the beginning of a process. Isaiah mocks the physical presentation of God as a man or as a statue of any kind. He imagines how the image is made by a carpenter using wood. He divides the wood in half, and the first half he makes a fire. And he says, "Oh, this is nice. It warms me." And he cooks his dinner over it. And then with his dinner done, he takes the rest of the wood and he makes him a god, an idol, bows down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, "Save me, for you are my God." So this is a kind of impulse against this kind of representation. But talk about how that went on a bit and how we ended up with the God that conventionally we do think that God is more spiritual, vaguely up there, but doesn't defecate, for example.
Yeah, primarily, it's a combination of things. As I said, the experience of imperial assault and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple and the looting of its objects, that already kind of put the kibosh a bit on the notion of God having a body. It rendered him too restrained and too vulnerable to displacement. But then you also have in the latter half, or particularly the closing centuries of before the Common Era, almost a transformation of old, kind of typically old-fashioned ancient Israelite mythologies begins to kind of sharpen and turn in a direction more towards the Hellenistic world, and it becomes essentially, you get a form of Jewish metaphysics, and Platonic ideas at this time were really bubbling up. And it's the idea that for God to be, for anything divine, but for the divine to be divine, the divine has to be completely and wholly unlike anything that the divine created, so the created world. And, and so therefore God cannot possibly have a body, because a body is something that we're all familiar with in our world, is a part of the created order and not the divine.
And it changes.
And it changes, exactly. And the divine has to be unchangeable, immutable, unchangeable, indivisible. And it's that emphasis on the otherness of divinity that really kind of puts the kibosh on God's body. But that doesn't stop his body. I mean, because people already knew that this was a body that was generally unseen. The gods generally weren't seen in their heavenly habitat at all, of course. But an unseen body is not the same as a non-existent body. But by the time you get into the early centuries of the Common Era, when these Platonic ideas are really taking hold theologically within Judaism and Christianity, so gradually it's not just that this is a body that is unseen, but this is a body that is non-existent. This body no longer, never existed, so the theological claims go. But it's an extraordinary change.
Well, as you say, the fascination of the Bible is that it preserves what the practice of Judaism and Christianity left behind. And you can see, if you're attentive, you can see this process taking place, but you can see each stage along the way, and it does bring about a recovery of another, and you say tenderly physical, sometimes a relationship with the concreteness, you might say, or the tangibility of God. I want to say to the viewers of this program that Francesca and I have barely scratched the surface of this book. Let me just say the one word: circumcision. Now, there's a rich and interesting topic, but you can find all kinds of unexpected things about circumcision in this book, and many another equally startling topic. But I think we've reached the point where we're ready to entertain a few questions. So let us now invite Politics and Prose to step in and take charge.
Fantastic. Thank you both for talking. And I have to say, that was the most page numbers during an event I've ever heard, and it was beautiful. I was absolutely stunned by that. So just all the close reading of the text, it was just beautiful. So here are some questions that came up from our lovely people watching from home. One thing to know to the people who are watching is you can upvote any question that you like the most. So if someone else has asked the question that you really wanted to, if you want to put that to the top of the list, you can click the little thumbs up button. It'll move it up there. And also, if you have any questions, we can still take a couple more. Okay, so a lovely woman named Suzanne has a question about how you did your research, and if you were sticking mostly to the biblical text, or if you branched out with the Roman Catholic text that came afterwards as well. To be more specific, they wanted to know as well to the saints, because saints had, how do I want to phrase this? Because the question is this. They want to know if the saints have incorruptible bodies as well. And so I guess first, before I dive too much into that question, because there's much that follows, is did you do research into the saints?
Not so much the saints, because I was really focusing on on God's body. But I don't just stick to the text that we find in the biblical canon or canons today. So I look at a lot of the Gospels, for example, that didn't make it into the Bible in the end. I look at a lot of comparative texts, like both early Jewish, early Christian, but also a lot of myths and archaeology and iconography from lots of ancient Southwest Asian cultures. But yeah, The saints in themselves, I didn't really get into because I wasn't particularly, they weren't my main focus. Whether they have incorruptible bodies or not depends on what kind of a priest you're talking to, and the answer that they would give you. So yeah, but there's a great book I can recommend, a fantastic book as background to this, a brilliant scholar called Jack Lightstone, who years ago, maybe like 2000, maybe more than that, wrote a great book called The Commerce of the Sacred, in which he deals with some of the burial places and holy sites associated with early Jewish and later Christian saints. And it's a fantastic book. And he talks about the idea that their bodies were somehow transformed into this kind of divine, almost divine matter, dead bodies.
Let me add that this book does range, as late as at least medieval and Renaissance Christianity. And one book that pops into my head that I also was very impressed by is Leo Steinberg's book called The Sexuality of Christ in Renaissance Art and Modern Oblivion. We will not go into that book, but she does carry, Francesca does carry her research down as late as even the Renaissance. And also equally late rabbinic discussions of various topics, in which, of course, the Hebrew Bible figures centrally.
Yeah, and early Kabbalah, and it's all it kind of ranges quite widely. But I think that's important because it's all about the reception of these ideas as well. Because our Western Christianized notion of God is not the only one, if you like, that was on the table. And so it does range quite widely. But I loved it. I mean, researching it was fun. But I have to say, it's the hardest. I've written a lot of books, but they've all been for scholars. This is my first book it's research and it's scholarly, but it's pitched at a non-specialist audience. And I have to say, it's one of the hardest things I've done, just trying to not dumb down the scholarship, but to make it accessible and to make it make sense.
There are books done by scholars which are popularizations of something that has been done for scholars, but I would say also, Francesca, that this book really hasn't been done in this way by anybody before, even scholar to scholar. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think it is doing something quite. I think so. I'm British. I get very embarrassed and modest. I think it's quite unusual, this book.
I've never heard of something that goes into what the body of God and all of it being. There's different ones I've seen on Christ, but I've never seen one that does.
No one has pulled it all together this way before.
Exactly. So for one question is just, how did this start? How did this question become something so large that you made a book off of it? How did you begin?
It started, if I'm completely honest, and I talk about this at the very in the preface to the book, in the prologue. It started when I went to university. I went to Oxford when I was 18. I did a theology degree, and I went to Oxford to do theology because I really wanted to find out how come this God is so different that he didn't make it, that he made it into the modern world, and all the other gods and goddesses that I loved reading about, the Greek gods and goddesses in particular, how come they didn't survive into the modern world, but he did. And when I was at university, it was the first time I'd studied the Bible, and my lecturers and professors kept telling me that this was a God without a body. Every time I said, "So God is a man, God is male," and they said, "No, this is just metaphor." But it seemed to me that some of this language and these images that were being used in these texts were reflecting the idea that this was a deity who was understood to have a body. The remarkable thing about his having a body was that he occasionally had allowed people to see it. And so it was that. I just wanted to find out, how come no one's talking about his body? And so in a way, that the journey to this book started a long time ago. But I've taught my undergraduate modules some of this stuff. And so I've been thinking about it for a number of years before I wrote it. But I was just ready to sometimes you just have to be ready to write a particular book, I think. And I was ready to write this one. I'm really sorry about my cat meowing her head off.
You were so fine. It's adorable to see animals. A different question, and this is for both of you, is when either of you picture God, since you have done so many of these things, and if you're going to picture, let's say, a Jewish or a Christian deity in your mind, what is that image for either of you?
I'll let Jack go first.
If this is too personal, also we can.
I'm going to answer out of my personal history. I am, Francesca might or might not know this, I am an ex-Jesuit. So Ignatian prayer always begins with a simple exercise: place yourself in the presence of God. And that sentence is very abstract, without any kind of rich or vivid content. But it is the one thing that has stayed most strongly with me over the years. It changes the world around me as soon as I say that sentence. But what I can say is that it summons up vastness, not just planet Earth, not just the solar system, not just our galaxy, but other galaxies. The Big Bang, the possibility that there were other Big Bangs, other universes, all of that, and then beyond the all, something else. And so it doesn't exclude anything physical, and it doesn't exclude human physicality, but any other kind of physicality, but transcends it. And I can't coherently put a question really to something that vast, but I can place myself in its presence and stay there for a while. That's how I pray.
That's lovely. That's really lovely. I mean, I'm not religious myself. I never have been. And I wasn't brought up in a particular faith tradition, but I've always been, this God character and I have I like to think we have quite a fun relationship in the sense that I'm just intrigued. I'm forever I've been intrigued ever since I was young, and I'm really, it's about what it says about these ancient human beings. I think that's what I find the most exciting. And so in a contemporary context, I think you can learn an awful lot about people who believe in God, and I'm interested in the ways in which their idea of God, what that reflects about them. And most of the time it reflects some pretty wonderful things about them, actually. I mean, obviously God is like, and the Bible, can be used for horrific, kind of used as props and as weapons to beat people with. And that's just a part of the human condition, I suppose, is that you're always going to get people who are going to claim that they have God on their side and to justify doing the most horrific things to other people. But yeah, I would hope that if there were a God, I don't think he'd approve of that sort of thing at all.
I tend to agree. Thank you for both those answers. This is a more practical / logistical question. And this is from Alice, and they would like to know about the reception of the book. Has it been different in the UK or in the US? Has it been different elsewhere if it has been published elsewhere? Also, I think the cover might be different between the UK and the
cover's different. Do you want to see like that? It's so, because I like different markets. So this is the UK cover.
I know, it's stunning.
The footprints from the temple that I was talking about, and obviously this is the US cover with a lovely statue. But that surprised me, because it seems to be like, I trust publishers, they know what they're doing, different markets and different book covers. But generally speaking, I've been really surprised that the response has been so positive, because it's quite a contentious, provocative subject. And I kind of forget, I've been doing what I do for so long, that you kind of sometimes forget that when you step outside of the lecture room, that it can be quite a provocative topic. But the response has been great. I mean, no matter what I do, I've done a lot of TV and stuff in the past as well. And there are always people that get very, very cross with me for saying anything about the Bible or religion. Doesn't matter what I say. And often they're cross with me because I'm not Christian. Normally they're cross with me because I'm a woman. And so I've had those kinds of responses from certain quarters, both sides of the Atlantic. But generally speaking, it's been really well received. I mean, the book's coming out, it's going to be translated into various foreign languages, so I'll be interested to see how it goes down. I mean, and it's being translated into Greek, so I'm partly worried about how my Greek family are going to respond to it, to be honest, because it is quite provocative for the yayas on our island. So yeah.
Are you going to be translated into Hebrew, do you think? Do you know?
I don't know. I'm hoping so. I'm hoping so.
That was very interesting for me. Some very interesting interactions began after my book, God, a Biography, was translated into Hebrew.
Yeah, I bet. Is that the kind of thing we should talk about off camera?
Someone just asked, and it seems like a good time to ask it, is this going to turn into a Channel 4 series? Is that what they wanted to ask?
I would love it. I would love this to be, I mean, it's a very visual, I mean, this is about visual, the book is so much about the visual, and it's stuffed full of pictures and drawings and photographs of various artifacts. I mean, it's loads. So it lends itself very well to the visual kind of presentation.
Be careful though, be careful that you maintain some kind of control, because your material is very subject to turning to purposes that are not yours.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, in terms of the UK, I'm very happy for it to be a book. It's been serialized on the radio, on BBC Radio 4.
Oh, really?
Which was great.
Oh.
Yeah, just 5 episodes excerpts, which was great. That's
terrific. That's
yeah. I enjoyed that. But yeah, I'm happy for it to stay in its covers.
All right, I have an odd question that I just deeply want to ask both of you, because it's been a question in the back of my mind for years. In Genesis, there's a moment where there's a wrestling moment with God, and I feel like that takes a physical form. So do you have thoughts on this? In your research, did that come up? Did you think about talking about it? Did it come up in the book?
Yeah, it appears in the book. I don't dwell on it for too long. What's interesting about that tradition is that in its biblical context, it's understood to be that this is God wrestling with Jacob, and neither one can kind of almost like defeat the other. They're kind of quite equally matched, which I quite enjoy. But a lot of scholars think that it's drawing on older traditions, because it takes place at night. It takes place in a very liminal space, this kind of river crossing space. So it looks like it might be quite an old mythological tradition that's basically been adopted and adapted by Yahweh worshippers to I have another interpretation of that. That being with whom Jacob wrestles is called in the Hebrew Ish. Man.
Ish ordinarily means man. It can mean being, but the normal plain Hebrew, you might say, meaning of it is man, and the man could easily be Esau, because Jacob is returning from Aram to Palestine, and his brother Esau, the one whom he has defrauded, is living there, and we know that he's a big, strong man, and Jacob sends his entourage, his wives and children and livestock to a safe place, and he goes off to another place to be, and it is, by the way, is on the overlooks the Jabbok, which is a spectacular ravine that comes down into the Jordan River from the east. So it is a very stunning spot, but it would be an isolated spot, and he there's a wordplay there on the Hebrew word panim for face, and when Jacob actually does meet Esau face to face, he says something in Hebrew. I don't have the particulars in front of me, but it's a wordplay on the word for face, and it seems to be alluding to the fact that they had this prior encounter. And remember that Jacob was the younger brother. He was hairless once. He was a softie once, but now he's got 2 wives. He could probably wrestle with his older brother and hold his own. You see, this is another interpretation of that scene.
And he was working with sheep, so he probably got stronger and stronger. There you go.
Yes.
That's a good point.
Okay. Let's do one more, and then I think we're gonna have to start wrapping up. There was one that was just put in the chat. Let's head over there really quick. It was put in by a human named Alan, and is in contemporary liberal Judaism, there's been a serious effort to divest the divinity of a male identity and bring them into more feminine qualities. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a brilliant move. The same thing has been happening in some forms of Christianity too. I think theologically, ethically, in terms of theological ethics, I think absolutely it's a great thing to do. That's one of the benefits of getting rid of God's body, if you like, is because then it's a lot easier also to get rid of ideas of sex and gender. On the other hand, I think again, it's without wishing to undermine that very important theological move. It's so important simply because these religions have been so deeply patriarchal for so long, and have vilified those who aren't men. But it's hard to get away from the masculinity and the maleness of God in the Bible. Interestingly, one of the precursors to Jesus as the kind of the word of God, he's called the word of God, the logos of God in John's gospel, was a feminine sort of offspring or daughter of God, Lady Wisdom, as she's called by some scholars, Sophia, and she, it's almost as if kind of even when God could have gone down the route of, who's gonna incarnate me? He could have had Sophia, this female figure, but he chose Jesus of Nazareth. So it's a shame. There's a lost opportunity.
There's one American short story writer said if Mary had had a girl, there would have been no crucifixion. God couldn't have gone through it.
Yeah.
My daughter, when she was 4 years old, and she never referred to male and female or man and woman. She referred to boys and girls. So she asked me, "Is God a boy or a girl?" And she was so mischievous and so giggly as she asked this, And so I gave the conventional Christian answer, God is neither male nor female. He is a spirit. And she said, "I think God is a girl." So it's happening.
I like the sound of your
deep in the culture. There is a change taking place.
Thank you so much, both of you, for talking, for going through the book with such detail. Thank you for being willing to take all these questions. Once again, if you, as the audience, if you would like to purchase the book, it's in the chat. So if you'd like to purchase it, please click on that. It'll send you right over to our website and you can get it there. It'll be the one with the wonderful red cover. And then for both of you, one last thing before we go is just what's another place that people can go to get more information? So they read this book, and then what's another book that can be coincided or something to jump off into another topic?
In terms of more information, that's difficult. But I am currently reading one of my other big research areas. So I publish a lot of my scholarship on death and mortuary cults. And I'm currently reading Irving Finkel's book on the first ghosts. Which is pretty good. He's a curator at the British Museum and a Syriologist, cuneiform specialist. And yes, I'm reading that. So that's a pretty good book so far.
That sounds good.
And I'm reading a book whose author I nominate for a future program at Politics and Prose. If you haven't had him yet, he's right there in Washington, D.C. This is Mustafa Akyol, who has written a very fascinating, deeply historically rooted book by a man who is a Muslim and will remain a Muslim, Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. Is an outstanding work.
That sounds amazing. Both of these sound like great books to hop into.
I would actually say as well, though, just to answer the person's question properly, like the one book that I read that made me want to do a theology degree at university was Nikos Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation. The film version, The Last Temptation of Christ, terrible. The book is extraordinary. And there's another example of this kind of really intimate relationship between the deity and humans. That is a spectacular book. It was obviously written in Greek in the 50s, published in the 50s, but But yeah, published in English, and it's fantastic. So I would read that.
Do you read modern Greek? Did you read it in Greek?
Not well enough to be able to read a novel, no. So I read it in English, but it's absolutely extraordinary. It's one of my favorite books. Upsettingly, it's disturbing and unsettling, but also rewarding and exhilarating and tender. It's amazing.
Paul's letter to the Philippians says that Christ is like to us in all regards, and that would mean certainly that he experiences sexual attraction.
Yeah, exactly.
And dreams, imagines futures for himself.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. The more and more that you get into it, it's amazing. Okay, I think that's everything. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to the audience for being here. And if you need anything for Politics Prose, as always, be free to come into the bookstore and ask any questions. Thank you so much. Bye.